What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some freshly revealed details about Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2, specifically about how some of its narrative and RPG elements are going to work, as we just recently, yesterday from the time of this video, got a stream and a couple announcement posts detailing some of these things, which were, up to this point, pretty unknown for the sort of rebooted development that we got via developer The Chinese Room. Now, I want to kick this video off by saying that, for me, this announcement stream showing these things was a bit of a mixed bag. There were things that I liked, there were parts I did not, but to be very blunt about this up front, I think for a game going through a troubled development cycle when you're finally starting to share news about it, this particular showing was not necessarily a strong one by any stretch, at a time when you really want to be putting your best foot forward about these things, and because of that, my overall stance on this game is very much so wait and see, having mostly to do with its, again, troubled development cycle. But the point I want to make here at the beginning is that there's a lot of reasons to be skeptical about this game, and you very much so should be. I think it would be naive not to be. And while I am someone who really enjoys Vampire the Masquerade, and I genuinely want this project to be a success, I still personally have very mixed feelings about the entire thing, but from there let's actually dive into the newly revealed details, with the main one, I would say, being that our main character is going to be an elder vampire known as Fire. And in this manner, I would say they took a lot of cues from Cyberpunk 2077 here, as it appears that we'll be playing a somewhat established character. However, they will be somewhat customizable. You'll be able to pick their clan and gender, alongside a background as well. So while you are playing a set character, there's some ambiguity to who that character is, much like we see with V in Cyberpunk 2077. And I think they actually took that a step farther in terms of comparisons, but we'll get to that in a moment. Now, to break that down a little bit farther though, for starters, I think Fire is a very weird name, as it is spelled P-H-Y-R-E, and for me, every time I hear that, all I can think of is the Phyrexians from Magic the Gathering. And when it comes to clans, there is going to be 4 available at launch, and then they mentioned that a couple others would be coming via DLC. What's more, they also didn't explicitly state whether or not we could customize this character, though they did show off some set models for both the male and female version of the character. So right there, just a few more notes. One, I think the only having 4 clans isn't necessarily a deal breaker, but then to post after the stream talking about how they have more planned for DLC is probably putting the wagon before the horse a little bit. It's nice to have DLC plans, of course, but seeing as this game is probably at least a year out still, the fact that they're planning on putting clans behind DLC walls isn't necessarily good information, I would say. And what's more, I don't know how customizable this character is going to wind up being in terms of their appearance. As I mentioned, it showed a few different options, but whether or not you can actually customize this person's face or anything is yet to be seen. I didn't get the impression that was the case, so it's seeming like it's somewhat unlikely as of now. But now that we've got that out of the way, who is Fire? Fire, as I mentioned, is an elder vampire. They have been asleep for the past 100 years before being woken up in Seattle with a strange mark on their hand, covered in thin blood vitae, or blood, while at the same time somehow being trapped with a thin blood voice, so to speak, in their head. Again, reminiscent of Cyberpunk 2077 here, though that part in particular is likely meant to bridge the narrative in knowledge. Now, I honestly assume this connection that you have with this other entity known as Fabian is likely something to do with the mark that they keep making a big deal out of on Fire's hand, but essentially, Fire's going to be walking around with a thin blood vampire known as Fabian stuck in their head. I imagine the goal of this is twofold. As an elder vampire, that vampire in this setting should know pretty much how to be a vampire, which makes it hard to naturally introduce very basic concepts in terms of the narrative. But on the flip side of that, as a vampire that just woke up from torpor, Fire doesn't know anything about the modern world. So the connection between these two is going to give you an established reason to both teach a new player to the game and setting the basics of what this world is, while at the same time giving you an excuse for Fire to learn how the modern world works, which she shouldn't know. And I enjoy that idea as a concept. I think its execution will largely come down to how annoying it is to have Fabian always interjecting, but as a narrative device, I think the concept fits this setting and its purpose pretty well. So I think if they can pull that off, that's not necessarily a bad thing by any means. That is to say, it has some potential potential. Now from there they go on to talk a lot about the roleplay options available in this game, starting with gaining power. As an elder vampire, you're going to start the game with a fair bit of impact, as they put it. You're not going to be defenseless by any means. However, because you've awoken from torpor, you're still going to be relatively weak compared to your powered up self. So as you play through the game, you'll be regaining some of that lost power and coming back into your own strength. So while you'll likely still be decently strong from the beginning, they've definitely given themselves some wiggle room in terms of incrementally increasing your power as we see in RPGs. But the other part of this is making choices and how the world reacts to you alongside consequences to those things, which culminates in endings, of course, and they did touch a little bit on these things as well. For starters, there's the clan choice, as I mentioned. This is going to dictate the powers that are available to you, though it is my understanding that there's a little bit of flexibility there. But your strengths and weaknesses will be determined by the clan you pick, and while we are playing a set character, you're supposed to be able to play around with the background of what that was specifically a bit, with the devs even implying that as vampires aren't exactly known to be the most honest of creatures, there will be situations where you can just outright lie about what it is Fire was up to beforehand, implying both that your background and the choices you make and how you present yourself to individual characters and players in the vampire world of Seattle will have an impact on the choice and consequence of the story, which includes feeding on the citizens of Seattle. I would say they made a point to express that the way you treat citizens, hunting, as well as other kindred will all have an effect on how the ending of the game plays out. So whether you're a vampire that's taking the lives of the citizenry in your own hands and treating them as the food source that they are, or if you're trying to be more humane, keeping your beast in check, that should have some sort of effect on the gameplay, which includes things like the resonance system, though they didn't go into a lot of details about that specifically. But they did mention that your clothes and things like that will determine reactions from a lot of the individual characters you can meet. How they address you as a result will change, though I'm curious how in-depth that system will wind up being. But they did make a point to express that your character's outward appearance will have an effect on how people react to you, though what the consequences of that are remain to be seen. But they did also make a point to mention that there will be multiple endings to the game. Endings that will be determined by your choices, of course, but also how you interact with people, like I mentioned, including, vaguely, the citizens of Seattle. So exactly what they mean by that is vague, of course, at best. But in any event, they want the endings to reflect the long-term effects on both the city and the individual characters you'll meet and interact with. But honestly, just nice to see that there will be multiple endings. And then towards the end of this talk, they teased a little bit of whether or not there would be a yellow taxi involved in this game, and this is a reference to Kane being in the first game in the form of the taxi driver. Though the answer to this question was also vague, but the fact that they brought it up at all, and the fact that it's a sequel to the first game, makes that seem a little on the nose, I would say. At most, they implied that it probably wouldn't literally be a taxi this time. But all of that said, that's pretty much the information that they covered in this video, but now I want to leave you guys with a few thoughts here. For starters, as I mentioned, there's a few things I like here and some stuff that I don't. So on one hand, in terms of the stuff that I like, it does seem like they're putting a big emphasis on the RPG aspect of this, and while they didn't show a ton of that, it certainly seems like they have the right ideas, and things like the narrative structure that they described I think could work if executed properly, but it's obviously a little too early to say on those things one way or the other because we haven't seen them in motion. Apparently there's going to be more of that coming around the beginning of next year, so stay tuned for that, but there was also a lot of things about this showcase that leave me, again, just on the fence about a game that really needs a strong showing. So for me, things like having a voiced protagonist who is a set character is a bit of a bummer. I always prefer a silent protagonist myself, but obviously that's a subjective thing. People will be mixed on that in general. I know some people prefer a voiced protagonist, and I'll also be a bit disappointed if they don't allow you to customize the appearance of this character, like at all, outside of simply male or female, as I think that would be a pretty big missed opportunity. Moreover, the gameplay that they showed of this during this showcase is rough around the edges, very much so. The animations in particular, I would say, need a lot of work. And while the game is far enough out that that is not a pressing concern of mine, it is definitely noticeable, and in a showcase where you really want to be putting your best foot forward, I think they really failed to do that in this regard. But putting all of those pieces together, I would say, while these are interesting details to get and learn, and I appreciate that they're trying to set expectations now, none of these reveals or details really pushed me one way or the other. I'm still very much so on the fence and skeptical about this game, and just hoping it will wind up being good, because so many of these ideas aren't necessarily deal breakers, it just depends on how they get implemented and those ideas are executed upon. For instance, even having a set established character isn't necessarily a deal breaker, depending on the writing and whether or not that character is interesting, but it's also certainly not my first choice either. So as has continued to be the case with this game, it's still very much so a wait and see game for me, but now that they're actively sharing information, I think we'll get answers to these questions before too long, as they are planning on sharing exactly what those playable clans are going to be relatively soon. And then, as I mentioned, towards the start of 2024, they're going to be talking about the actual gameplay and showing some things off, like the powers and disciplines, that kind of thing. And as always, when that stuff comes out, I will cover those details as well, as I'm following this game pretty intently. As a huge fan of the first game, I just need to see where this winds up going, good or bad. But in any event, that will do it for today, so I certainly hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think about all this down in the comments section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.